Welcome back. Pastors
Just me and no phone number, right? Okay. So can we start in 12 seconds? Okay. 10 seconds.
Some clarification on tithing.
Being enabled to forgive somebody who causes an offense
Does
towards
it really matter whether someone is Protestant or Catholic?
The genealogies are different from Matthew to Luke.
I was wondering what the Bible said in terms of what I should do.
This is Pastor's Perspective. We're here every Monday through Friday providing answers on a variety of topics, including the Bible, end times, other religions, and the family. Call right now with your question at 1-888-564-6173. That's 888-564-6173. You can also post your question at facebook.com/Pastor's Perspective. And now here again is your host, Brian Perez.
And Pastor's Perspective is sponsored by California Baptist University Online and Professional Studies, CBU Online, Live Your Purpose. I am Brian Perez, and we have got quite a program for you today. In the studio with me, Pastor Brian Brodersen of Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa in Southern California. And through the wonders of modern technology, on Skype, we have got Ed Stetzer, the executive director of the Billy Graham Center at I almost said Whittier College, Wheaton College. I'm a California guy, so Whittier.
It's a fine college. It's a fine school. It's a good school. We're for them, too.
Yes. All right, Ed, great to have you back on Pastor's Perspective.
Well, so good to be here by the wonders of technology. And it is a little confusing with two Brians, but I'm just going to go with it. As someone should have planned that out. But anyway.
Well, it works. We can kind of, if somebody says something stupid, we can just say, well, it was the other Brian who did that. So.
That's right. They'll never know.
That's pretty awesome. That's a good strategy right there. Well, if I had another Ed, we could say two Eds are better than one.
Oh,
thank you very much.
Man.
I'll be here all week. Tip your waiter.
Yes.
All right,
so Ed's on the program today because he's got a new book that he's written, and it is a great book. It is called Christians in the Age of Outrage, How to Bring Our Best When the World is at its Worst. And yeah, that's a good way to put it. The world is at its worst right now.
Yeah, and Ed, thanks for coming on today. You and I have been talking about getting together and doing this. Of course, you sent me a copy of your book. I was anticipating the book coming out because the title itself, the minute I heard, that you were writing this book, I thought, boy, this is a book that needs to be written at this time. Mm-hmm. And because we're living in an age of outrage, like none of us here, I'm the oldest guy in the room, but guaranteed none of us have seen a cultural moment like we're experiencing right now. And I think there's a lot of, there's confusion among Christians about how do we navigate this? How do we respond to this? And there's, on the one hand, there's the temptation to just go completely silent. On the other hand, there's the temptation to just jump into the rage. And I think that this book, which I read and loved, I think this book really helps us at a critical time. Ed, you did a fantastic job. And so what we want to do today is we want to kind of just talk about the book. I want to start by talking about the title and, why you came up with the title. But then I want to walk through some of the quotes in the book that really stood out to me. And, as I was rereading them today, I was like, oh, this is just a great quote. I put a couple of them on Twitter a couple of weeks ago. But how Twitter is. You're limited. You got to do 3 tweets to get a great quote in there. Thank God they went to 240 versus the 280 versus the 140 characters. But nevertheless, some of these quotes were too long, but they're great quotes. So today, I'm actually going to quote them. So,
we're going to do it.
But Ed, so let's talk about just the title itself.
Well, so here a little bit of irony is, of course, as you've written books, so that a book, you've got to have a book done almost a year before it comes out.
Yep.
And then probably it takes 6, 7, 8, 9 months to write a book. So it was 18 months ago, I start thinking, that, man, people are outraged and not dealing with it well. And sometimes it's Christians who are not dealing with it well. Sometimes it's Christians who are targets of the outrage. And so, we talk about both. But so I began to write and thinking, well, maybe we're at the peak. Maybe we're at peak outrage 18 months ago. And I think a lot of people thought we were at peak outrage 18 months ago. And boy, were we wrong. And now it's turned all the way up to 11. And the volume is just, people are upset. And I think that Christians are struggling to know how best to respond, how best to reply in the midst of it. And so that's my hope. I'm a missiologist by training. I have a PhD in a field called missiology, and that is basically how you teach people to engage culture. So I train missionaries to engage cross-culturally. So this book is a practical, street level look at how we can engage our outrage culture missiologically.
Yeah. Okay, and of course, when normally when you think of missions training, you think of, well, I'm going to go to the foreign field, I'm going to, learn a new language and all of that. But as you point out in the book, we actually do now, but probably more than ever, we have a mission culture we're living in it. We don't really, we can go other places, and some people should if God calls them to, but we don't have to go anywhere because we're living in on the mission field.
Yeah, and everywhere is mission field. The mission is now from everywhere and to everywhere. We're at the stage in Acts 1:8. We're at the uttermost parts of the earth. When Jesus was talking about the uttermost parts of the earth, California and Chicago were certainly uttermost from where Jesus was. So I think ultimately, I think John 20:21, as the Father has sent me, so send I you, reminds us that all Christians are sent on mission. The only question is where, among whom, doing what. So this is our mission moment. We didn't choose this mission field. We didn't choose the moment we're born in. The question is, will we be faithful in the midst of it?
Yeah. That's so true, and that's great. And just to let everybody know, you mentioned Chicago and California. That's because you are sitting in Chicago at Wheaton College, and I am sitting in California.
Yeah, I've actually sat in that room, and I will tell you, it's a lot sunnier and it's a lot warmer where you are. I think we have had I think today's actually a nice day, but we've had some dreary days, and it's cold. And so, and it's just begun. The darkness, fun fact, you ever notice that like September is the 9th month, but it means 7, and October is the 10th month, and it means 8? Well, because they didn't actually count January and February originally, but they were just darkness. So basically, you don't have that in California. But basically, they kind of shoehorned in later and then moved all the months back because basically December was the end of life, and then it came back in March. That's my life. So welcome to Chicago and people all over the world.
Okay, well, we're glad that you're there and we're here. And
there you go. Well played. Well played, Brodersen.
Okay, so Ed, just really quickly, the book is divided into 3 parts, and part number 1 is why the Age of Outrage. Part number 2 is outrageous lies and enduring truth. And then part number 3 is the outrageous alternatives to outrage. So I want to just look at a couple of the chapter titles here, and I want you to comment on these if you would. So in the first part, why the Age of Outrage? Outrage cause number 1, a cultural forking. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so if you go back 50, 60, depending on where you are in the country, 70, 80 years, there kind of was a consensus, a Judeo-Christian consensus, that even people didn't go, none of us have had in our lifetime a time when the majority of people regularly attended church. You didn't, your parents didn't, my parents didn't, our great-grandparents. You have to go back to the 1800s to see that. So really, regular church attendance has remained relatively steady for decades. But what's happened is, when I was a kid growing up on Long Island outside of New York City, we were Irish Catholic. So we didn't go to church, maybe Christmas and Easter, but we were what we thought of ourselves. The Catholic Church was the church we didn't go to.
Yeah. Right.
And we didn't like Protestants. So we sort of all stuck together, even though we weren't engaged and involved. That's the way culture was 50 years ago. And that would be Baptists in Texas. They're more Baptists than people in Texas. That would be Lutherans in the upper Midwest, whatever. And so what's happened, though, is that those kind of regular church attenders have remained somewhat similar in their values, while the culture, like, for example, my family, who are nominally Catholic or nominal Lutherans or nominal Baptists, they actually sort of adopted more of the cultural values. So although church attendance has not collapsed, and everybody thinks it is, but you've read the stats, no real researcher actually thinks that, but it's kind of in the water now in the popular culture. But what happened is popular culture or mainstream culture moved away from us. And so now there's been a fork in the road, and probably the majority of culture, sees our views on marriage or morality or the uniqueness of Christ as the only way as not only odd, but in some cases actually dangerous. Yeah. And so if you went back 50 years ago, that was mainstream culture. So now we're out of the mainstream culture. We're on the other side of the cultural fork, and the divide between us and mainstream culture is growing year by year, and that's fueling some of the outrage.
Yeah, and that's what you address in that chapter. And then the second chapter, and I do want to talk about this just for a second. I don't want to go totally into detail on it, but it's a factor, obviously. You put it here, outrage cause number 2, the technology.
Yeah.
So, and you've got some great stuff in this book on technology. You've got great stuff on engaging in the realm of social media, because that is a thing now. It is. 10 years ago, it wasn't that much of a thing. Nope. 25 years ago, it wasn't even a thing. And now it's a big thing.
It's a dominating thing.
Yeah. I mean, you and I are both on Twitter. We're both on Instagram. I'm on Facebook, but I'm not on Facebook. But, these are they're like their own planets. It's amazing.
Exactly. Yeah. And neither of us are on Pinterest because we're men and only women are on Pinterest, which is statistically true overwhelmingly. So if you think back, so I was on CompuServe in the 90s, right? And we had little forums and CompuServe's dead now, but we had these little forums and chat rooms. And then it cost like $1 to send an email. But then 10 years ago, the iPhone comes around and other devices like that, and it shapes and changes everything. So now people spend a substantial amount of time. I mean, people at work, right? People maybe listen to our program, maybe they're at work. They probably have in their background Facebook open, even though they're working on something else. And that little red ding goes and it draws them back in. So what's happening is we're increasingly being discipled by our cable news choices and spiritually shaped by our social media feed. And the end result is we're ending up not being transformed in the image of Christ, but instead we're kind of being discipled and shaped by the culture that we may agree with politically, but how we respond to that is not Christ honoring if we're driven by things other than the work of the Spirit in our lives, the shaping that comes from knowing and engaging the Word of God and more.
Yeah, great. Okay, so part 2, just jump into part 2, outrageous lies and enduring truth. And so I kind of want to keep the conversation more focused on, we as Christians and kind of the, how do we navigate this versus, what the world or the culture is thinking about us. We kind of know some of that already, what they're thinking about us. So let's go to the lie number 2. My outrage is righteous anger. So, because Christians the Christian community is outraged along with the rest of the culture. It's not exclusively just the rest of the culture is outraged and we're just sitting by, in bliss. Lots of Christians are outraged. And I see this on social media especially, and it's one of the things that's very disturbing to me. It's troubling to see the way Christians engage with an attitude of outrage. So my outrage, a lot of times, it is that people feel this. Jesus had righteous anger, and we're supposed to have righteous anger, and this is my demonstration of righteous anger.
Yeah, and there are times actually for us to speak up about righteous anger when there's injustice. And I'm upset when I see things that are wrong and broken and people being hurt and more. But the reality is that I've seen and you've seen some pretty stunning things Christians say on social media. And actually, I'll look at something and somebody says it's so horribly offensive, and then I'll click on the link where goes to their bio page or whatever. And the first thing is Christian or follower of Jesus, sometimes pastor. Yeah. And I think to myself, you're doing this wrong. Yeah. And sometimes people say, well, I'm an American. I get to say whatever I think. And I get that. But then they say, well, I'm just trying to be frank. I got to be frank. I said, listen, if your name's not Frank, stop. And if your name's Frank, be Jesus-y, be more Christ-like in this approach. So I think for a lot of people, they have sort of this is where it comes back to being discipled by your cable news choices and shaped by your social media feed, that echo chambers form. Yeah. And that amplifies things. I mean, so again, I'm conservative theologically, I'm conservative politically, but what happens is when you get an echo chamber, you believe really worse and worse things about people that disagree with you on the other side of the political spectrum, to the point where you're willing to believe the biggest, most horrible conspiracy theory. And I think one of the sad things is, people are still like the whole Russia investigations always in the news. So let's not say, I'm not saying anything that everyone doesn't already agree with. Here's what everyone agrees with. There were Russian trolls who tried to divide the country. Now what they did, I mean, everyone agrees with that. So that's not up for debate. But here's what's sad is that they actually had a couple of news magazines took pictures and posted the pictures of people they were targeting, and it was conservative Christians because they found them to be an easy mark, easy to fool.
Yeah.
Wow. And I think, and why would we not be surprised when we're getting fooled by, like, Starbucks hates Christmas because they took Christmas off of their cups when they didn't take Christmas off their cups. Yeah. They never had Christmas on their cups.
Yeah.
So for me, I think we've got to help people to not get an echo chamber that just builds their outrage, and then they just blurt. Yeah. Because even if you think that you should blurt, I mean, if you're trying to build bridges for people who don't know Jesus, and your neighbors disagree with you politically, and all they see on your Facebook feed is how much of an idiot people who think like them are, you're burning those bridges, not building those bridges.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of things that contribute to it, but I've thought about this myself often, and I've, of course, in teaching and preaching, there are times when some of these kinds of things will come up, but I think, that in some kind of a strange way, the Christian community in the U.S. in particular, we've kind of developed a bit of an entitlement sort of a mentality that, we're entitled to, basically we're entitled to never have pushback. We're exempted from persecution because of the First Amendment or whatever it might be. But I often remind people, like, the New Testament, the book of Acts, I mean, you can't even read a page of the book of Acts without seeing some kind of pushback from the unbelieving culture and oftentimes some intense persecution.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't wish that on us. I pray that it never happens. But the reality is we've never been promised that it wouldn't happen, even in the United States, right?
Yeah, I think part of the reason is that people feel that way. Is that we have had home field advantage for a long time.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think with the cultural forking we talked about earlier, we've kind of lost home field advantage. So, most evangelism in the 70s or 80s, or even may go back to the 30s or 40s, it was basically people who sort of maybe talked about being Christians, but they didn't know what it meant to be born again, to trust and follow Jesus. And so, but now we're finding ourselves where we don't only have home field advantage, we have, as you put it, pushback from the culture. And it's not this incredible pushback where there's persecution. And there certainly may be places where people have stood and lost a job or something to that effect. But again, I think for a lot of people, it's kind of like these faux controversies, like the war on Christmas. They're so upset at the war on Christmas here. And so you kind of just, when you go to Walmart or Target or whatever, and the clerk doesn't wish you Merry Christmas. So we're coming up into the holidays. It's past Halloween now. People are starting to get their Christmas decorations up at the stores, which is like, no, you shouldn't do that. But they're, you're going to go to there and, just mid-December or late December, you're going to go through the line and the clerk might say Happy Holidays. And so you should snarl back, Jesus is the reason for the season. That's what you should do. And they're sort of like, no. It's not the clerk at Target's job to wish anybody the good news of the gospel. It's your job and my job as followers of Jesus. So we've lost that privileged place in culture, but the mission remains. We didn't choose the time in which we live in the mission, but we choose whether or not we're going to be faithful to it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. All right. Well, we can talk more about that, but I want to move on because there's still a lot of stuff that we want to talk about. But like I said initially, the book is divided into these three sections. So we come to the third section of the book, the outrageous alternatives to outrage. And there's a few of these that I want to really drill down on a bit here. Kingdom ambassadors in a foreign land. I really loved a lot of what you had to say there. Some great insight into just the role of an ambassador and what that looks like. Talk about that for a second.
Yeah. Okay. So this is not our home. I mean, the Bible clearly says that. You've preached through books that speak to that. This is not our home, and yet sometimes it feels like we're fighting for the home field advantage. And so now, again, I believe in standing up for religious liberty. I believe in advocating for just laws that make a better society.
Sure.
But ultimately, what we see happening is that people are sort of fighting. For example, people will fight to take my country back. Well, but the reality is Jesus hadn't called us to take our country back. This is not our country. Yeah. Now, again, people say that, and people get freaked out. And I'm like Mr. Patriotic on July 4th. We got all the fireworks, and we go to a parade. We got a parade one block. You don't have a parade in Southern California.
Hey, wait a second.
Illinois,
we
got
got
a parade.
Yes,
we
in
do.
Huntington Beach.
On July 4th?
It's the greatest parade this side of the Mississippi, as a matter of fact.
Well, that's we're the greatest parade on this side of the Mississippi. It's a matter of
Huntington
fact.
Beach is a little smaller than Chicago, too, I must admit.
That is true. Well, this is just our Wheaton parade, but it goes on and on. But the point is I love my country. I'm thankful I was born here and I'm a citizen here.
Yes, I do not doubt your patriotism.
But my home is not this place. Right. I'm here to represent Jesus. So if I got to choose values, I'm going to choose values of the kingdom of God, not just values that are temporal of this place and this time.
Yeah.
So I think representing Jesus is really key, because that if you're representing Jesus, you'll deal with your social media differently. You'll deal with interactions with others differently. You'll put all those things under the lordship of Jesus Christ for the cause of his mission.
Yeah, and that's the idea behind being an ambassador, right? You're a representative of
representing
Jesus. Yeah. Winsome love is another chapter. We're going to talk about that later, because I want to read a direct quote on that. And we've already talked about online activity to a certain degree, neighborly engagement. Some of the stuff right there at the end of the book where you just got into some of the real practical things.
Super practical.
That we sometimes, it's kind of like we know it, but we forget it. We complicate it. We make it so difficult, and it's as easy as just going next door and being a good neighbor.
Yeah, so part of it is just what Christians have actually called for years faithful presence. Yeah. Is just being there. So you want to lower the outrage in the world, engage your neighbor. And, I have neighbors who deeply disagree with me. Now, I talked about in the book, the last place I live, where I mapped out my neighborhood, 8 people who lived within 2 or 3 houses of me who didn't know Christ. And Donna and I built relationships with them, invited them over, had their kids over, shared the gospel with 7 of 8 of them, not just invited them to church, but actually shared the gospel. Saw one family 3 doors down come to Christ, baptized them. Family across the street, baptized them. Guy catty corner, saw him come to Christ. So why? Because ultimately, I can't fix everything, and that's ultimately going to be Jesus' job. I mean, I'm going to engage, and I've read the end of the book, and Jesus wins, so I'm always hopeful. But I think for us, so I actually here's how to make a chart of your neighborhood. Here's how to pray for your neighbors, because I really want neighbor. That chapter begins with Mr. Rogers as an example.
Yes.
And I love Mr. Rogers. I love Mr. Rogers.
I saw you tweeted that you had seen the Mr. Rogers movie on a flight.
Yes,
and
I did. Yeah,
and you got all teary and everything.
I'm crying like little girl.
I saw that. I thought, it's such a baby,
I am kind of a baby.
And then I got to confess, I was flying home and I watched it. I didn't cry, but I absolutely loved the movie. Absolutely loved it.
Certainly flaws in it that we would, have differences with.
Yeah.
But for me, I grew up in a broken home, alcoholic dad, parents divorced. And so for me, Mr. Rogers was, my mother told me that every day I'd rush home to watch Mr. Rogers. I didn't know he was on every day.
Yeah.
And it really shaped me. But he's the one who taught us to use neighbor as a verb.
Yeah.
You neighbor. You're not just a neighbor, but you neighbor.
Yeah.
And I think that Jesus sends us on mission into our neighbors, into our neighborhoods. Yeah. And so I think that we try to give some practical steps in Christians in the Age of Outrage to really help people bring their best in their neighborhood with their neighbors.
Yeah, after seeing the movie, and I literally saw it on Friday. I got home, I preached on Sunday, and it fit in with my message. And at the end, I said, there's obviously areas where theologically we probably would have some big differences. But if every person acted like Mr. Rogers, boy, the world would be a pretty good place,
It would be. And what's funny is that movie was not out when I wrote the book, and the publisher, and we have Tyndale's been a great team, amazing. But they actually said, I don't think people will know who Mr. Rogers is. And I said, if you don't know who Mr. Rogers is, there's something wrong with you. But just she was younger than me, and so
yes.
But then the movie came out, and now it's a cultural. And I guess there's I think there's an actual another movie.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was a documentary we saw. And I think Tom Hanks is playing Mr. Rogers.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
That's amazing.
Would you be my neighbor, Brian Brodersen?
Ed, I consider you my neighbor, even though you live thousands of miles.
In the cold tundra of the north central states.
All right, we could talk more about Mr. Rogers and my granddaughter's love for Daniel Tiger, who is the new Mr. Rogers, but we got to move on. Ed, There were some quotes that I want to pull from the book that just really stood out to me, and just said, just in a paragraph maybe, and sometimes maybe even more in a sentence, things that need to be said and things that need to be heard. So I'm going to start with this one, and I can't remember. It's in the early part of the book, but you said this: the most damaging example of Christians at their worst is when someone claims a kingdom-based identity but pursues some world-based end, trying to use Christianity to achieve political, economic, or social objectives only increases the outrage directed toward us. I think that is absolutely true. Talk about that for a second.
Okay, so what happens if you actually go back? I do a radio show called Breakpoint This Week that Chuck Colson started, and one of the things Colson said when he was in the White House, and he said later he talked about this. He's got this fascinating story. He was in the Nixon White House, becomes a Christian, all this stuff. But one of the things he said is that evangelicals or faith leaders were often the people who were most easily fooled. So here's the thing. I know you know this, but politicians want to use us, and they want us to believe them and be completely uncritical of them, so that we can get our desired ends. And what I would say is at the end of the day, first of all, you should not be all in on anybody other than Jesus. You shouldn't be all in on any elected official, any candidate, any party. Because again, Jesus is not coming back on Air Force One. He's not riding back on a donkey or an elephant. Now, I recognize that Christians will vote and will end up in certain places because of their values. Mm-hmm. But I think part of the challenge is that for some Christians, they have seen their faith co-opted, but unable to say, you know what, I really like a lot of what this person does or says, but what he or she just said is just stunningly wrong. Yeah. But I can't say that, because then I'll lose the loyalty back. Right. And the world sees that. The world sees when we have sold our spiritual soul for political gain. Yeah, they do see it. They see it way more clearly than we often see it, and it's a super bad witness. I remember reading Billy Graham's biography. I think was it Just As I Am? Was that what it was called? Autobiography. And Billy, if anybody had relationships and influence and connections with people in political power, it was him, right? And he said himself, toward the end of his life, he said he looks back over it and he would not do it the same way if he had to do it again, because he felt that he was quite often being used with hindsight. And certainly we saw that with some of when the tapes came out from Nixon, which he later apologized for. And he was always cautious with engagement with politics, and he wanted his focus to be the gospel. He did meet. I mean, you're right. He has met. Mr. Graham met more presidents than any person ever. Not any religious leader, any person ever, because he met President Trump before he was president at his 90-something birthday party. Yeah. So, but he also said, for me, I just need to. People urged him to run for office and endorse candidates. Mm-hmm. He said, "I'm going to preach the gospel." Yeah. And I think that single-minded focus of Billy Graham is probably good for us to remember as well. Although we're still going to vote, we've got, we're going to vote and we try to make our society better. But that's got to be our primary focus. Yeah, and I think even for us, for me, in pastoral leadership and in a ministry in the public eye. I like Billy's example, and I even like more what he said about even the possibility of being used. And everybody's different. I'm not judging somebody who's maybe more politically connected or engaged than I am, but I just think, man, it's an area where we really have to be wise. Yeah, and one of the things that's strange. Let me just give some numbers, and when I give numbers, sometimes people get mad at me. But math doesn't care about our feelings. So here's the math. Evangelicals, you and I would be in the evangelical camp, and even the other Brian, we're evangelicals. Statistically, we vote much more Republican than the population as a whole. Mm-hmm. The matter of fact, the more you go to church as a whole, the more likely you are to vote Republican. And there are some outliers like African American community and others, but statistically that's true. Now I know I'm making people nervous as I talk about this, but stay with me. Statistically, and everybody knows this, the less you go to church, the more likely you are to be a Democrat. I'm not saying that if you're a Democrat, you don't go to church, so don't hear what I'm not saying. What I'm saying is statistically there is a correlation, a connection between these realities. So what happens is, though, is that some evangelical Christians and others, people who want to see their neighbors won to Christ, they are so aligned in the politics of the moment that they're actually burning bridges with people who have different views of politics. And I think therein is the challenge. My first priority is Jesus, his mission, and his kingdom.
All right, we've got to take a quick break, and then we will be back with more Pastor's Perspective, Pastor Brian Brodersen, and our very special guest, Ed Stetzer. Hang on.
Pastor's Perspective continues in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. Pastor's Perspective continues. And now, here's today's host, Brian Perez.
And Pastor's Perspective is sponsored by California Baptist University Online and Professional Studies, CBU Online, Live Your Purpose. Brian Perez here with Pastor Brian Brodersen, Senior Pastor at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa in Southern California. And our very special guest today via Skype is Ed Stetzer, who's got a new book out. It is called Christians in the Age of Outrage, How to Bring Our Best When the World is at its Worst. All right, so we were talking about statistics, I believe.
Yeah, it was sharing some statistics there. And so, Ed, I wanted to move on because I've got these quotes that I just think...
Okay, I just want to say we did end on some controversial statistics. So I just want people to hear that there's a divide between religious and irreligious people around politics. I'm using statistical language, religious and irreligious. And I would say that there's a greater cause, and that's engaging them for the cause of the gospel. Don't let the important issue of politics undermine the essential issue of sharing the gospel with your neighbors.
Okay, great. Okay, so that leads me to the next quote. Here it is. So, Christians can try to make their stand by turning back the clock. We can try to reclaim a cultural form that is dying, if not already dead, or we can grasp the central truth of the moment in which we live, understanding the challenges and opportunities Christians face in this new culture. We have to consider both the moment we are in and the mission we are on. This is just so important, Ed. I think I actually did tweet this quote out because you really summed up, I think, what we need to be doing as Christians at this time. So you want to elaborate on that a bit?
Happy to. So think in terms of the desire some people have to sort of go back to a time when people were more religious or more engaged in church. And I get it. There are peaks in the 50s. There are peaks in the 80s. So those were the peaks of attendance. Not huge differences from where we are now, but peaks in the 50s and the 80s. And so some people want to go back to a time when we were more religious, had more influence in culture, like the 50s. But I got to tell you, when Christians had a lot more influence, they didn't always use it. And I don't know a whole lot of people of color who want to go back to the 50s.
Yeah.
And so what I would say is, rather than pining away for the past, why don't we join Jesus on his mission today? Again, we didn't pick this time, but we have to choose if we're going to be faithful in this time. And the moment we're in does impact how we live out the mission we're on. And I think that's really key. So that means we're answering questions that people didn't have to answer 50 years ago. We're answering questions about sexuality. We're answering questions about the nature of truth. We're answering questions about where does Christianity fit in the kind of the views of all the religious ideas in the world, and the Oprahification of American religion. And so, but here's the question though, right? Some have already kind of raced to embrace the world's ways and forms, and we've actually seen just huge, even stunning decline in religious groups that sort of embrace and just go with the flow. So some might say, well, let's just be, cantankerous and stand against it. And I would say that's not helpful either. So there's a better way. And that is, I think, to ultimately kind of shape our lives and our values around showing and sharing the love of Jesus, get in small communities of people, small groups. This is, often extensions of our churches, who can do what the writer of Hebrews says, provoke one another to love and good deeds, so that then we live on mission in our communities. And I gave the example in the book of Columba, who's a very famous early church missionary, who would go out and they would start communities. And in those communities, they'd evangelize the neighboring region. And I think we need that today. We need communities of Christians changed by the power of the gospel, living on mission in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, and I think this whole thing, Ed, I think in one sense is what we're talking about is a missional vision for Christian living. And I think a lot of Christians just simply have never thought about life in those terms. Anyone who's been a missionary, anybody who's moved to a different culture, you understand that. You understand that you're going into a foreign environment. You understand they do things differently. You understand there are things where you have to adapt, and that, kind of like we said, I think at the beginning of the program, that's really what we're faced with now. We're faced with a different culture that we have to make some adaptations in our own way of thinking and our own way of behaving if we're going to do the ultimate thing, which is not, make or not go back to the traditional America that we have in our, maybe even the myth that we have in our minds. But if we're going to get the gospel out and fulfill the Great Commission, because that's really what we're supposed to do,
right? I think that's what matters most. And really, it is, by the way, your word myth really does. I don't think I use that in the book, but it's right on. Yeah. There is a sense that we were this, actually, when I go to a conference and there's like 3 sections, I ask them, what percentage of people do you think went to church regularly in the 30s and the 40s? And almost everybody, that's section 1, says between 60 and 80. And then I ask them, what percentage in the 50s and 60s? I ask the middle section, and they almost always say around 50. And then I ask today, and they almost always say around 20 or 30. But the reality is, actually, Gallup has actually been asking this question since 1938, did you attend church? And it's about the same in 1938 as it is today. So we've always been kind of a religious minority, those who regularly attend, not always in the last century, who regularly attend and engage in our faith, and it shapes our lives. But what's different is there used to be this cushion, this buffer, this squishy middle of America, 50, 60% of people who were nominally religious, kind of consider themselves Christians, but didn't shape their lives around it. And I'm not saying all of them aren't Christians in just whatever state or status they're in. But I think what's happened is that squishy middle, they changed over the last 20, 30 years. Yeah. And they have now increasingly thought more. As a matter of fact, if we do research, people who are nominally Christian, who say they're Christian, but there's not a lot of shaping there, they actually believe like secular people on almost all issues today.
Right. Yeah.
And that wasn't true 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I've said this actually publicly. I came to Christ in the 70s, and I came out of a nominal Catholic family Sounds similar to your situation,
Very
Irish
similar, I think,
Catholic,
yeah. Yep.
broken home, all of that. So I came to faith, the 80s, the Reagan era, the moral majority, all of that. And I started hearing then that we lived in a Christian country. And I actually said, I would have never known that by my own life experience. I didn't even think in those terms. So that's why I use the word myth about what we often project back onto the past.
Well, first of all, theologically, countries can't be Christian.
Right.
Jesus saves people. He doesn't save countries in the same way.
Exactly.
And I think, too, it's really key. So we were never a religious majority as far as regular church centers are, being shaped by their views of faith. But we are, and we should acknowledge, we're a convictional minority.
Yeah.
And when you know up front that you're a convictional minority, you can actually live that way, be faithful and fruitful. And so let's not think of you mentioned the Reagan era. Ronald Reagan used to say that we're like a city set upon a hill. And there's actually a quote, de Tocqueville says that. It's not just a Bible quote, though it all kind of traces back to that. But really, America is not a city set on a hill. First, because the Church of Jesus Christ is the city set upon the hill. Now, we want our country to be more right and righteous and godly and appropriate and make choices for human flourishing. But this is not like Israel. This is not a land like Israel had. We're really in exile. So this is more like Israel in Babylon, when in Jeremiah, God says, pray, work for the welfare of the city. When it prospers, you'll prosper. So we got to acknowledge we're in exile and we're working till Jesus returns, but we're doing that as people that this is not our homes. Back to that ambassador idea as well.
Yep. So in the book, I'm going to kind of summarize the question that you were presenting, where Christians are looking at the increasing hostility toward the faith in the cultures and wondering, what are we going to do? And wondering to some degree, is the church going to survive? And in relation to that, you said this. You said the siege mentality overlooks the simple truth that every Christian lives in the midst of a mission field where God has called them to contend faithfully for the gospel. The age of outrage is no different. It is our mission field. It is both useless and destructive for us to pine for some golden age of cultural mission when God has set before us a culture that needs the gospel of Jesus. In this sense, the age of outrage is the context within which the gospel must take root. Now, again, we're kind of drilling down on the same thing, but you said it so excellently there. We do have to get rid of the siege mentality. That's, I think, part of the root of the problem.
Yeah, and I think part of it is sometimes we feel that they're coming at us, and sometimes they are.
Yes,
that's not, early on in the book, I used the example of a well-known Christian leader who's accused of giving to really radical, right-wing organizations like Young Life and Dare to Share and stuff like that. And it's like, really?
Yeah.
So I get that there are really unfair people, and there are people who have a vested interest in making us look fringe and more. There was someone sent me an article today that was written about me and saying, look, he's just trying to, make Christians, evangelicals look better. Actually, I think we got a lot of work to do. But what I would say in the midst of all that is that we don't respond in kind. I mean, that's like kind of Sermon on the Mount-y kind of stuff, right?
Right.
We don't respond that way. And when we do, if we just start kicking each other in the shins, as recently one politician said, all we end up with is always sore legs. And I think ultimately that one of the things, and I tried to sow the book with examples of surprising ways that Christians have built relationships, sometimes gospel conversations, and ultimately conversions, because they didn't follow the path of the world, but looked more like Jesus.
Yeah, and you gave that great example of the Chick-fil-A.
Wasn't that awesome?
Yeah, that was a great example. Yeah,
so where Chick-fil-A is sort of known for, for some of their supporting of Christian values.
Yeah.
But then some of the leaders building relationships with people from the LGBT community intentionally, and that makes a difference.
Yeah, that makes a difference, right? Okay, now I want to go now to different places, moving along in the book. This part I think is so important because you did something here that I think was really. It's vital for us to get this. You kind of psychologically sort of diagnosed what's going on in the mind and the heart of the outraged secular person, and you did it in such a way as to get us to see that, look, this is the person that needs the gospel. That's really what's at the root of these expressions that we're seeing. They're caused by something that is lacking in the person. So let me just read the quote. It's a bit of a longer one, but behind every expression of outrage in our age is real need, brokenness, and destruction that our message of reconciliation through Jesus is meant to address. The age of outrage may be defined by its anger and polarization, but beneath these self-defense mechanisms are real and valid underlying questions as people try to understand their origin, identity, purpose, and path in life. People have never been more engaged, busy, and connected than in this cultural moment, yet this flurry of activity is a thinly veiled attempt to cover a crisis of identity, purpose, and belonging. The foreign land to which we have been called is in a crisis of lost identity, misplaced purpose, and chronic loneliness. The boredom experienced by so many in our culture leads to outrage and harm toward others. Outrage then becomes a misplaced substitute purpose. I think that is exactly what's happening here, and you hit the nail on the head.
Well, I think part of the reality is we forget, when we see people as enemies, sometimes we forget that a lot of people are hurting, and sometimes we're hurting too. And everyone has some sort of, no one gets through a broken world unbroken. So I think in the midst of that, people are vying for meaning in ways that really remind us that we need to find ways to share the good news of the gospel with them. Yeah. So for me, I don't want to see, even people I deeply disagree with, spiritually, I see people not as my enemies, but maybe as prisoners of war, that the enemy has captured them in ways. And the great promise of Jesus is the gates of Hades, the force of Hades will not hold back the advance of the gospel if I'm willing to be used as such. And so in surprising and beautiful ways, I think when we see people, and we talked a lot about the Imago Dei, the fact that people are made in the image of God. Yep. When we see people that way and engage them as people who need Christ, I think it changes the way we, not that, I should say the world's not going to like it when you talk about people that way. But I think ultimately it actually shows a kind of compassion that Christians sometimes lack.
Yeah. And it's easy to, you just see somebody ranting or raving or threatening or, being even violent in some cases. And, I think the automatic and the natural response, of course, is, like you said, responding in kind. But the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is teaching us.
I've heard that Sermon on the Mount thing.
Yeah. No, don't do that. Don't do that. That's your natural inclination.
Just summarize the whole Sermon on the Mount right there. That's like Matthew 5-7. Yeah. Don't do that.
Yeah, but then when you get down and something you were talking about the local guy here, I can't remember his name. Somebody in the area where I'm at who came out of a prison background, came to faith, was released from prison, started a church, has a mega church here in the area, and he said something in regard to his ability to kind of reach the person that's ex-prison or gangs or drugs or whatever. He said, through my own experience, God has enabled me to see them through the eyes of a doctor rather than the eyes of a judge. And I thought, man, what a great statement!
That is so insightful.
And because that's the thing. I think we often, and I'm guilty. I'm not sitting here saying I don't do this or haven't done it, but you see them without any sympathy. You don't look beyond and see, okay, there's something deeper that's driving this person. That's why I like what you said here, because you're getting down to the fact that there's something that's driving this rage in people, and it's ultimately their lack of purpose, their failure to understand their identity. And there's a lot of talk today about the Imago Dei, about the image of God. It's kind of, come up in recent years that we start to talk about this and think about this. But I think it's a really important thing because every person This guy just recently with the shooting in Pittsburgh, and you probably saw the interview of this Jewish doctor who attended to the man who murdered everybody.
Yeah.
And what did he say about the man? He said, "This man was somebody's baby."
Yeah.
That's how he's viewing him. What went wrong? Yeah. And I thought, wow, that is amazing. What an insightful.
And by the way, I think an important moment in our culture when an anti-Semite terrorist is actually treated by a Jewish doctor.
Yeah.
But I think for all of us, the challenge is that we are attracted to the angry voices. Right. I'm so thankful for programs like this, but you drive across the country and listen to some talk radio.
Yeah.
People are attracted to that and they love that. And what I would say is it feeds in us. Yeah. So it's funny. I mean, think about a guy named Glenn Beck. He's a guy like Glenn Beck.
Yeah.
So Beck actually has a new book called Addicted to Outrage.
Yeah.
Where he talks about, I was on a show and we both have books on outrage, but he was explaining where, I mean, he's an addict. And people it feeds something in them, and that's not the spirit. That's feeding the flesh, is what we would say as Christians. Yeah. And so I think ultimately we got to find a way to feed the spirit that causes us to live and engage differently.
Yeah. And you address that in the book. You talk about the importance of discipleship. You talk about the importance of the word fashioning you and prayer and those kinds of things. I want to try to close with that, but before we get there, there's one other thing that I want to bring up: the Christian attitude of disgust toward the culture, which I think is part of the problem, but then winsome love as the alternative. So here I'm going to quote you again. Most distressing is how this attitude of disgust so easily infiltrates Christian thinking and engagement. It is crucial that we grasp how this attitude invalidates our claims to love. It transforms what should be a gospel-centered love for sinners as potential vessels of God's mercy into a conditional love predicated upon our cultural and political fears. We stand, I love this right here, this is brilliant. We stand at the water's edge of society, yelling at the objects of our kingdom mission to clean themselves before we can come any closer. This is not Christian love, and as such, it is neither winsome nor effective. Christianity in a broken and rebellious world is going to be offensive, but we aren't supposed to be. Winsome love doesn't speak to whether we disagree. Rather, it shapes the way in which we disagree.
Yeah,
Great
I think that's,
paragraph.
Well, and it's key stuff because, I mean, ultimately, so disgust there's actually a field of scientific inquiry now, is that there's something, and we already know, like, there's certain things that we're disgusted by.
Yeah.
If there's a dead body near an animal on the road, you don't go, it disgusts you. If there's, human waste, it disgusts you. You're hardwired to do that. But disgust, actually, what we're finding is that people are getting so disgusted with people who disagree with them that they're willing to believe anything about them. They're willing to say or do things that are really pretty shocking sometimes. Yeah. And what I would say is that there's a better way. And so the opposite of, I don't know that the opposite of love is hate. Maybe it is. But I think the opposite of love is disgust. It's just, I don't even want, you're not even valuable enough for me to care about. Yeah. And we see that, if you watch YouTube, you go these, and it's like, so-and-so got owned. So-and-so got owned by so-and-so else. But we're so disgusted by that person. We just want to see them just squashed by somebody who's more articulate or spoke louder or whatever. And I think that feeds a darkness in the soul that ultimately the Spirit wants to root out. Yes. He doesn't want us to be disgusted, even with people who deeply disagree or live lifestyles that deeply disagree with us, with individuals. We might be disgusted with sin and brokenness, but for us, that love for people has to shine through. Yeah, and because if you do hold that disgust, in your heart, that automatically really just eliminates any opportunity with the person you're disgusted with, because who wants to talk to a person that they think is disgusted by their very existence or presence? It just shuts down it just shuts the whole thing down. So I love what you said about winsome love. I love what you said. You're very honest in the book that, of course, in a broken and rebellious world, we are going to be offensive inevitably because the gospel itself, the very nature of it, is offensive to the human sinful heart. But we don't want to be offensive
through our approach or our attitudes or our personality. If somebody's going to be offended, let them be offended by the gospel, but let's not offend them just because of our own personal preferences or likes or dislikes or whatever. All right, so we're winding things down here, I think, Brian, right?
Yeah, about 2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes. Oh, my goodness.
Oh, so in conclusion.
Okay. So Ed, here's where we're going to go. You touched on this in numerous places in the book, but I just want to kind of wind down with it. Basically, what you're talking to believers about is really behaving like believers, and the need for being thoroughly discipled in God's Word, the need for cultivating and developing your prayer life, the need for living in fellowship, community, and those things. So just wrap it up with that, if you would.
So I felt a little guilty that at the end of the day, the answer is the things that we already knew were the answers. The answer is people changed by the power of the gospel, living in community with others who are changed by the power of the gospel, seeking to spread the power of the gospel into communities. We give some very practical ways to do that. But at the end of the day, this is what Christians have known for 2,000 years. Sometimes we forget, and we need to be reminded again. We've got to adjust the lenses sometimes to see the world the way Jesus calls us to see it. And I think we need that lens adjustment right now. So again, that's what Christians of the Age of Outrage is about. But ultimately, it's going to be in churches like Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, or Moody Church, where I serve, or wherever else it may be, as we provoke one another to love and good deeds, to live on mission in the midst of a very divided world. Let's not add to the division. Let's show and share the love of Jesus.
Yeah. One last quote. You said this in regard to prayer. The discipline of prayer prevents us from venting, flaming, or savaging others, either in person or online. I've never seen people go after someone they're praying for. I think that's it's so true. And it is very practical.
Pray for people who need Jesus. You'll love them. You'll reach out to them. You'll care for them.
Exactly. Yeah. Great. Well, Ed, so great to be with you. Thanks for coming on, having this conversation. Thanks for writing this fantastic book. And the book's everywhere. So I think is your first printing already sold out?
We've already been to a second printing. We've been real pleased with the response because I think it hits a cultural need and a Christian need right now.
Absolutely. So it's out there, Amazon, wherever good books are sold.
That's right. Is it
the
available
Calvary Chapel bookstore?
Yes. Is it available as an audiobook as well?
It is as well. Wayne Shepherd, very well-known voice of Moody Radio, did that as well.
Very nice. You've been listening to a very special edition of Pastor's Perspective. I'm Brian Perez with Pastor Brian Brodersen of Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, and our guest, Ed Stetzer, whose book, Christians in the Age of Outrage. What a great book. You've got to pick this up. Subtitled, How to Bring Our Best When the World is at Its Worst. I think we can also call it How to Go from Fuming to Perfuming. How does that sound?
That's good.
Well played there. Well played.
Yeah. Anyway. Ed's going to steal that and use it.
That's my new sermon that I'm preaching Sunday.
There you go. All right, so I'll put the link on our Facebook page, or you can call the chapel store and order yours, 714-540-2941, 714-540-2941. For Pastor Brian Brodersen and Ed Stetzer, I'm Brian Perez. Thanks for listening. Good night.
Thanks for listening to Pastor's Perspective. We trust you've been blessed and had your question answered. Join us Monday through Friday and follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Pastor's Perspective. The preceding was sponsored by Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, California.